Design lecture series. Good turnout. Spring series is great, so hopefully you'll tune in and come to all of them. Plenty of information around, I think, on the website and in the posters. I'm trying to think, Mark, any other kind of like housekeeping that you can think of? Yeah? Okay. All right, so for those of you that don't know me, I'm Gail Fulton. I'm the director of the School of Landscape Architecture, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Lola Sheppard tonight. I first started paying attention to lateral office in the mid-2000s. I was thinking about this today. There was a publication called 306090, which I think is now no longer in existence, yeah? And there was an essay that they did, an essay and project called Flat Space. And I think at the time maybe the firm was called Lateral Architecture. Is that true? Yeah. Oh, okay. But anyway, that work I always thought did a great job of integrating architecture, landscape architecture, infrastructure, and asking really interesting questions about the city and to a certain extent the larger landscape. So for those of us I think that have been interested in landscape urbanism and that scale of topic for a long time, Lateral Office has always been a firm that continues to turn out great work that's really rooted in deep research and understanding of place, but then also this kind of larger way of thinking about architecture and design that is really compelling and I think in line with a lot of what we're trying to do in the college. So as I said, we have the great pleasure of having Lola here tonight. She's an associate professor at the University of Waterloo and a co-founder of Lateral Office, which launched in 2003 in partnership with Mason White. They describe their process as a commitment to design as a research vehicle to pose and respond to complex, urgent questions in the built environment, engaging in the wider context and climate of a project, social, ecological, or political. Lateral Office privileges architecture as a mutable territory that is formed out of and respective to its history and environment. Operating at the intersection of architecture, landscape, and urbanism, Lateral Office work posits that the role of the architect is not simply problem solver or designer, but cultural, environmental, and spatial detective, bringing to light the forces at work within a site-specific climate and geography, and able to look for synergies between issues and opportunities. And hopefully that language resonates with a fair amount of you. Prior to her founding of Lateral Office, she worked in architecture firms in Rotterdam, Paris, and London. And she's also a director of Infranet Lab, which is a nonprofit research collective founded in 2008 that probes the spatial byproducts of contemporary resource logistics. Beyond the many projects, publications, and awards they've completed or received, Sheppard and White are also the authors of the book Many Norths, which I think we'll hear some about tonight, which looks at spatial practice in a polar territory. That was published by ACTAR in 2017. And pamphlet architecture, many of you have probably seen, I know certainly in my studios, you've seen pamphlet architecture coupling, strategies for infrastructure opportunism, which was published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2011. And hopefully you all know about the fact that Sheppard and White co-edit the journal Bracket, which there's 3 issues. Agriculture, on farming, soft systems, or go soft, and add extremes. Yes. Okay, and hopefully there's more to come. But those are fantastic publications with a lot of rich project work across a great span of kind of scope. So with that, please welcome Lola Sheppard.
For that introduction, and it's great to be here, and I'm amazed at the turnout. I wish my own school had such great student participation in the lecture series. So I'm going to try and spend a brief amount of time maybe positioning what we're interested in and how we try and approach projects, and then I'm going to try and cover probably too many projects, and we'll see how far I get in all of this. So We're a fairly small office. We're usually about 4, at most 5 people, including Mason and myself. As Gail hinted, we do a range of things. We curate exhibitions. We make books. We do speculative design projects. We do some a limited scope of public installations and small built work. So hopefully I'll be able to cover the sort of range of things that we do. I titled the lecture "Other Environments, Other Agencies" because those are two questions that I think have motivated us for a long time. So I want to unpack both of them. The first is this question of environment. So it's interesting when you look up the definition of environment, they talk about the idea of surroundings or influences on a particular system. It's tied to ideas of a kind of natural world or ecosystem. It can be understood as a kind of political environment. One can talk about it in terms of in computing, hardware or software environments. But what's interesting is the last definition, which is all the elements over which a designer has no control and that affect a system or its inputs and outputs. So this idea, I think is particularly interesting because particularly in architecture, but all designers are sort of trained to think that we are there to design environments, both everything from the kind of, environment, the comfort levels, the physical, the lighting conditions. So this idea that it's the very thing that we have no control over is interesting. And so when you start to kind of unpack different understandings of environment, one very interesting thinker is Jacob van Uxkol, who was a biologist and philosopher, and he talked about the idea of surroundings versus environments in relation to species. And he talks about the environment as something that is differentiated to the user. He says, and he basically, so he says the surroundings is all the physical things that one sees. So, in the first image, it's the sort of underwater condition. On the right, we see a kind of field of flowers. But when you think about it in terms of a species, he understands environment as that which is useful to that species. And so it's calibrated to the needs and the complexity of different species. So he says, for instance, that for the sea urchin, what his environment is really just the rock, the surface on which they inhabit. Or for the bees, what is their environment are the flowers and the places where they can pollinate. And the mountains and the grasses are irrelevant. And so this idea that environment is actually calibrated to the user, in Uxkol's case it's a kind of species, and is the more complex the user or the species, the more complex the kind of use and interface with the environment is. And so, and then similarly, another sort of person that remains really interesting to us is Howard T. Odom, who looked at sort of energetic systems in physical environments. And so he developed this term of energies, which was basically the sort of cycles of energy of inputs and outputs that shape a kind of physical, both natural and man-made environment. So here he's looking at the energy systems of shrimp mariculture in Ecuador, which is highly specific. But this idea that he can map or diagram inputs and outputs, both environmental, economic, political in the sense of labor, markets, capital, it becomes really interesting. And we started, there's a bit of a discussion in one of the third-year studios. I saw this idea of trying to kind of unpack the systems that shape an environment, and that those things are not only spatial, but they are logistical, infrastructural, political, et cetera. And so one of the questions that environment for me raises is perhaps challenging the notions of site that we're trained to think about as designers. And this came out actually out of an essay in bracket Go Soft, where really, if one, architects are interested in more and more complex sites, and where, there was a period starting, I guess, maybe 15, 20 years ago where we got interested in infrastructure, and landscape architects similarly got interested in large-scale ecosystems. And so it got me thinking that if we are going to tackle these much more complex and large sites, we need to kind of change perhaps the definition of site, and start to think about it, in fact, as a kind of territory. And this becomes evident, going back to this idea of sort of who are your users and your stakeholders. For instance, if you think about species migration, they transcend political borders, often they even transcend geographic borders and are tied to kind of ecosystems. So the idea that, we have a line that defines, in this case, Yellowstone National Park, species don't stop at a kind of political jurisdiction, and so they will have their own territoriality. Similarly, if one is, looking at a landscape and starting to kind of deal with issues of toxicity, that the site of a kind of toxic source may be far beyond the kind of site that you've been assigned to deal with. And so the boundaries that one needs to look at may be different and expanded relative to the kind of site of design. And this image will actually recur in a moment. This is looking at someone who's unpacking, all the kind of movements that happen in the manufacturing and packaging of electronics. And so, there's extraction of resources happening in Africa. There's processing happening in China. It gets sent back to Africa for other things. It comes back to Asia. It gets sent to Holland to be packaged. And so this cell phone that we hold, or even a piece of lumber that we may build with, has often crossed a border multiple times to be processed, et cetera. And so the kind of, in certain cases, to sort of engage a process, one needs to kind of zoom out and engage a kind of much larger territory. And this will hopefully become clearer in projects that I am going to show. And so the last question I want to sort of position is this question of agency. Kenny Kuipers, who's an interesting historian, with Isabelle Doucet in a book that's called Agency in Architecture, sort of asks, how does one define agency? And he says, it could be, is it the agency of the architect? Is it the agency of a project? Is it the agency of the user or the built environment at large? Or is it the agency of an architectural idea or concept? And I would argue that in some ways, at least in our work, and I think there are many people out there, that they're trying to do all of those things. They're trying to kind of challenge what the architect does. They're trying to challenge the role of a project. They're trying to kind of expand the users and how they might engage a project. And one of the people that has remained a kind of ongoing inspiration is Buckminster Fuller, who was, as you probably know, an architect, an engineer, and a kind of visionary who was sort of well ahead of his time. And one of the remarkable things is that already in the 30s he was looking and arguing that designers needed to think about resources and energy systems at a kind of global scale, which we sort of take for granted now. We've all done these kind of crazy, continental or even intercontinental maps, but to be thinking as a designer already back then was really pretty visionary. And he developed something called the World Game, which was basically a kind of collaborative game that forced or encouraged the players to literally collaborate to solve these kind of global problems. And he, of course, invented the sort of famous Dymaxion map, which I think is also a kind of interesting provocation, the idea that sometimes you have to kind of invent the drawings and the tools to kind of solve the problems that you're posing. And so this idea that one would think at large scales, that one would think across disciplines, and that one would develop one's own sort of systems of drawings, I think is something that has motivated us. And so if one is going to sort of grapple with complex issues that are perhaps beyond what we're trained to do traditionally as architects, we've started to think about this idea of research or detective work. And detective work is if you think about detective stories, there's this idea of following loose ends, and that you don't, if you think of any detective movie or detective show, they often don't quite know where they're going. They may have to follow a lead, and sometimes it's a dead end, and you kind of come back to the beginning. And this idea of sort of following leads, which is not the most efficient way of working if you were worrying about billable hours, but you often uncover things that you would never expect to if you followed an entirely linear path. So one of the things we we like complex questions that intertwine questions of territory, economy, and typology, whether it's new building typologies, new landscape typologies, new urban typologies. We're really interested in searching for the overlooked, the things that architects aren't and designers are not already looking at. And we're interested in spatializing phenomena that haven't yet been documented. We like to draw to uncover the larger social, cultural, and economic forces which shape a spatial phenomena. And we found that the answer often doesn't lie in a single solution, but in multiple interrelated responses. And so you'll see that in several of the projects, including, actually it started in the flat space project that Gail talked about, that we like to develop multiple projects that try to kind of create, circle around an answer rather than hoping that one project can answer it all. So the first project that I'll talk about is called States of Disassembly, Territory, Toxicity, and Electronics. And it was developed for the Seoul Biennale 2 years ago. And the sort of overall title of the Biennale was called Immanent Commons. And of course, a commons is the idea of the sort of shared global resources that transcend borders. So it can be water or energy or atmosphere. But the curator of the Biennale, that was Zairo Polo, wanted to kind of expand that definition to include, in a kind of now global era, things like making, communicating, sensing, recycling. And we were asked to choose one topic, and we thought, let's look at recycling. And we then sort of narrowed in on the question, because Korea, of course, is the land of electronics, we thought, let's look at e-waste and the kind of recycling of that. And so as I said, we quickly realized that the sort of landscape of waste is global. And if we think about the sort of territories we inhabit, we occupy territories of consumption, production, and waste. And the thing we're most familiar is the territory of consumption. We eat, we shop, we buy. We're slightly less comfortable already with spaces of production, so most of our industrial functions have moved to the outskirts of our cities. They're rarely, and that's a product of zoning that doesn't want messiness in our cities. But waste is really, historically would have been sent to the, perhaps, our further landscapes, and now are being literally sent to other ends of the earth, that we don't want to deal with it, we don't have the political will. And so Jennifer Gabris wrote a book called Digital Rubbish, and she provocatively says, the digital revolution, it turns out, is littered with rubbish. And it is literally producing these kind of landscapes of toxic fill, of e-waste. And so we set out first to just sort of understand what is e-waste. And it turns out that, e-waste is your phone, it's your computer, but it's also your microwave, your refrigerator, that everything now has electronic parts. And that what's interesting is that they contain a lot of rare earth metals in very small quantities, but they're valuable enough that for developing nations, it's still economic to receive this e-waste and kind of mine these sort of, rare earth metals. It's in fact completely illegal to ship our e-waste to other countries. There's a UN Basel Convention that said this is illegal, but it's happening. And what's actually interesting is I just read the other day that China has said it's no longer going to take even our simple plastics. And so this is causing a huge issue in North America because all of our plastic, which all of our cities was kind of shipping off, we can't do that. And I can only assume they will get tougher on things like e-waste as well. But what it produces is a kind of toxic colonialism, so the blue is us mapping where various rare earth metals are mined, and the sort of red clouds are the places where they are being sort of processed illegally. And so as you can see, it's sort of India and Pakistan and Ghana. And what's amazing is that there are entire portions of cities dedicated to this waste recycling, which is done, as you can imagine, in toxic conditions. People aren't protected, there's ill health, et cetera. So this is a site in Ghana, I believe, Agbogbloshie, sorry, my phone is ringing, where you have, a church, a football field, a mosque. So there's an entire city growing around this sort of toxic waste economy. And this was us sort of trying to kind of visualize some of these waste landscapes. So sites of extraction in the bottom left, smeltering of certain metals in the upper left, the kind of sort of hand rummaging that is so dangerous in the middle, et cetera. And we basically wanted to ask, what would happen if we actually took responsibility for our e-waste and had to deal with it, and what new building types and landscape types might emerge? And so we began we decided for the Biennale that we wanted to make models, that seemed a kind of way to engage users. And we said, we'll start with our own form of recycling. So we went and got old computers and hard drives and keyboards and various other things, and we disassembled them all. And then we neutralized them by painting them all white and discovered we had like almost instant architecture. Not quite, but it was interesting that one could start to read them as sort of fragments of buildings and cities. And we, as I said, we ended up developing 7 projects. And the idea was that no single one they're really like sketches. They're quick ideas that are really asking what new building types might emerge if one sort of reincorporated the question of waste. We've already, gotten much more comfortable with, for instance, soil recycling, composting. So these things have sort of entered our kind of, collective consciousness and starting to, imagine, produce new building types or landscape types at least. So we asked the same in relation to e-waste. So we developed these 7 projects, and I'm going to show 3 very quickly just to kind of give an idea. So the first one was called Exchange Campus, and it was this idea that on the one hand it would collect at ports, which is the place just before it ships off to other countries. One could collect e-waste, and then, sorry, I'm going to skip ahead. So there was a kind of spine, and so on one side, on the upper portion, you see this kind of landscape of containers and places to kind of store and receive the e-waste. And the other side was imagined as this kind of campus where one would learn, a kind of new forms of engineering, imagine new sort of educational programs that would leverage the kind of question of recycling, new technologies, et cetera. And so there was this idea of also pairing seemingly incompatible programs in some ways. The next project was called the We Market, and it was sort of playing off the idea of something like Best Buy. So we go to Best Buy and we go and buy a lot of electronics, and most of those are kind of designed to be out of date, within 2-3 years, either because technology improves or your battery dies, et cetera. And so we got interested in, could one imagine a kind of big box that would be really to go and get parts to either upgrade a component or make your own component or buy, improved or recycled pieces. So it was really this idea, there was a kind of conveyor belt in which things would come in and it would be sorted, and you could go in like any kind of big box store and purchase this kind of recycled economy or participate and create this new recycled economy. And so it was part kind of storage and part retail. And then the third one was, we called the Theater of Disassembly, and it was tied to this idea of kind of hacker culture and DIY culture, which is growing increasingly. And so it was this idea, and also the kind of culture of, on television, that I find we watch strange things on television, everything from like hoarders to, we were talking about the Food Network today. So there's this kind of interest in watching people be creative and do kind of sometimes surprising things. And so the Theater of Disassembly sort of played off of that. and actually also played off of, I don't know, we were talking about the anatomical theaters, which my partner studied way back when at Virginia Tech. So there was this idea of the kind of anatomical theater, which was a kind of form of theater where you would watch cadavers being cut up in the 15th century. So there was basically these sort of 5 theaters that would be for different kinds of events, and would be really a kind of performance space to encourage this kind of, learn how to do something or watch battles of people hacking things, etc. So these were these kind of theaters, and then they sat in this kind of grid, almost like a kind of Fun Palace by Cedric Price, a kind of large grid warehouse, and then the ground floor was the place where all the kind of e-waste was stored and could be brought up as needed to the theaters. So as I say, these projects were more a kind of provocation, and a lot of our work starts off at least this way. A kind of, what are the questions we're not asking? What are the typologies we're overlooking? What are the opportunities for design that we're overlooking? And that, of course, if one were to sort of, take this as a serious project, you would unpack the kind of logistics and the kind of needs of these buildings. But this idea that there are these sort of systems happening that shape our physical environment, that, as Keller Easterling would say, we can sort of reclaim as designers, is something that interests us. And so this was a kind of final drawing that sort of imagined this new e-waste landscape as a kind of counterpoint to the existing one, of silos and processing warehouses and theaters, etc. So the next project I want to talk about is Many Norths, which Gail talked about, and which is, I have a copy here after if anyone wants to take a look, which is the product of 8 or 9 years of research. And we got interested in the North partly, again, because we realized no one was looking at it. And in the case of Canada, it represents, depending on where you define the North, 2/3 to 3/4 of our country. And so we began rather naively. We knew nothing about it, and we just started reading about everything and anything. So to give you a bit of context, there is 110,000 people, so probably like one neighborhood of Knoxville, sitting north of 60 degrees, which is a territory of, I'm going to say, about 4 million square kilometers. So it is a lot of land with very few people. And tiny communities for the most part. The 3 capital cities are 21,000, 19,000, and then 7,000, and then you drop down to 2,000-3,000, and sometimes a few hundred. And the other thing that's worth noting is that, for the most part, there are no roads. And so everything is delivered, certainly in the Eastern Arctic, by boat or by plane, and I'll come back to this. So you have this sort of highly dispersed, isolated communities. And one of the reasons we got interested is we've all seen the National Geographic images of the polar bears and so forth, but there are people living up there, and it's the same in Alaska. Alaska is much more populated, so it's a very different context than the Canadian North, and much bigger cities, etc. But you have people living tethered by kind of various systems of infrastructure. And you also have a very large indigenous population, various different indigenous groups. And we've always loved this image because it kind of speaks to the conflation of modernity that was imposed by the South, and then these sort of indigenous youth that are like dressed in the clothes of the day, this is from '72, sitting in this kind of white spaceship school. And I think it speaks to the kind of challenges and maybe opportunities that architecture might have in the North. So we, as I say, began, we actually started doing research, and then we made projects, and then we went back and sort of consolidated a lot of this work into the book Many Norths. And we had basically sort of, well, many inspirations, but maybe 3 major ones. One is Glenn Gould, who's actually a famous pianist, but also did these interesting recordings of people in the North, and he would just record their stories. And it was this idea of multiple perspectives, that somehow you would get a kind of idea of the North, as he called it, through these multiple voices. To be noted, primarily not indigenous, so it was a kind of biased perspective, but this idea of multiple narratives really interested us. The second is the work of a Canadian geographer called Louis-Edmond Adelin, and he called Nordicité, or in English it was called Canadian Nordicity. And he talked about the idea of many norths, which became the title of our book, and I'll come back to his work in a minute. And then the last is the work of a filmmaker called Zacharias Canuck, who made a movie called Entrepreneurship, The Fast Runner, which actually won a Palme d'Or at Cannes, but really talked about kind of indigenous ingenuity responding to kind of environment and culture's kind of response to climate. So the research was sort of organized into five main themes. Architecture and urbanism, and then mobility monitoring, which was both military and research monitoring, and resources. And we made timelines, we have essays that introduce each chapter, we have interviews of all sorts of specialists, and then we have case studies. And so what I'm going to present right now is the case studies, or a few of them. But one of the things that was interesting, and this goes back to the question of how do you define site, is early on, we had long debates about, like, well, what is the North and how do you define it? And so these are some of the multiple ways you can define North. So there's the bottom line is actually what's called the task force line, which is what determines if you get government grants that help you kind of overcome certain costs from living in the North. Another line is the tree line zone. Another is the Arctic ecosystem line. Another is where the roads end, which has a huge impact on everything from like services to how you build, et cetera. And then Hamelin had his own definitions of middle North, far north, and extreme north. So this idea that, you know, depending on what you're looking at, you could have 10 different understandings of the North, you know, is sort of interesting. And in some ways, each case study responds to different definitions of North. So I'm just going to give you a sampling of 3 or 4 case studies to give you a sense of maybe how we approach this. So in urbanism, one of the things we looked at is landform and the relationship between geography and kind of town, the forms and morphologies of towns. So we actually produced a separate project, which we haven't really ever published, but is a document of every single town north of 60. So we've drawn every building that exists north of 60. And so we made these drawings that looked at all the different communities in the Canadian North. And we tried to kind of find ways that one could understand their sort of DNA. And there was a lot of debates about that too, whether you but anyways. So we one way to understand how things evolved was that many times, you know, extreme geography would produce these kind of tight linear settlements that held a town between the water and the kind of mountains. In other cases, these communities sit on kind of these sort of crazy pockmarked land that sort of negotiate land and water. And what's interesting is many of these towns are now suffering kind of major issues of erosion, and the entire towns need to be relocated. We also looked at questions such as sea lift, so how you get things up north, because as I said, there are no roads. And what you realize is that the north is entirely dependent on the south. You know, well, I was going to say for better or for worse, probably largely for worse. But so all goods, you know, begin either in Halifax or in Montreal and are sent by various private companies, and they will basically go from community to community delivering things. So once a year, when the sea defreezes, that's not quite a right word, but defrosts, melts, the boats can make it in, and they deliver the year-long supplies of fuel. You know, if you want your IKEA sofa, that's when you get it. If you need dog food, that's generally when you get it. And really, you try and only buy, you know, perishable goods which come in by plane because it's so much more expensive. And so what's interesting is the network. It's also, most of these towns don't have proper ports, so the boats will have to moor in the bay, and then a small barge has to go back and forth. You know, and there's crazy tide, so they have to go back and forth for 4 days, sort of loading and unloading all these sea cans, which makes it slower and more expensive. And then there's sort of interesting, unexpected consequences, like these sea cans often get left in the communities and become part of the built fabric, and they get used for warehouses and people's arts and crafts workshops, et cetera. We also looked in mobility at traditional systems such as Inuit trails and how they navigate. And this was done actually leveraging the work of an anthropologist whose work I'll come back to, but who had worked with elders mapping all the traditional trails. And so this was us kind of drawing and reinterpreting some of his GPS maps, but basically looking at all the traditional trails, looking at how they wayfind. They have amazing ways using topography and landform and ridges to kind of know where they are in the middle of a kind of white, vast tundra. They have all sorts of names for snow, so the kind of fine-grained quality of understanding landscape is kind of amazing. And then we looked at things like what do they bring when they go out on the land and all the things they pack. And then a last example of one of these case studies was from resources. So we looked at everything from like large-scale diamond mining, which has like huge, crazy, some of the biggest engineering projects, you know, that we've seen in North America. And then you have this kind of other notion of resources, which is sort of, in this case, country food. And so this is a kind of amazing phenomenon that is mussel harvesting. And one thing actually that I should say is that you may have noticed we always try to look at things in a kind of multi-scalar way. So often we would look at something at a kind of regional scale, and then we would zoom into a kind of, you know, the scale of a community or the scale of a port, et cetera. We would often make calendars to kind of understand the seasonality of things because that's so important in this environment. And then we would do sort of analytic drawing. So we sort of try to develop different drawing tools to kind of document these different things that often are not, you know, we're not doing the field work. It's not like we've discovered something new, but often they've never been visualized. And so this was important to us. So this is northern Quebec. And basically, in the summer, they harvest the mussels by the coast, which is the kind of hatch to the edges. And then in the winter, they go out on the ice because it freezes, and they go and harvest the mussels underneath the ice. And so what's amazing is that they would basically go out onto the ice, they dig a hole, they use their sled as a ladder, and they go down below the seabed, or the ice bed, I should say. So basically the ice becomes a kind of ceiling, a solid ceiling, and below there's a kind of tide that's going up and down by 40 feet. They have 2-3 hours to do this. So they go down, they harvest the mussels, and then they come back out. So this is kind of gives you a sense of the geography. And then there's people, and so this is us tracking the tides in the kind of calendar, and then there's people that stay up above the ice to say the tide's coming in, get out fast. And so this is a youth with his grandfather harvesting these kind of amazing, they're, you know, renowned for these kind of giant mussels. And so the idea that kind of landscape has an architecture, I think is also sort of fascinating, and it has these sort of cultural practices tied to it. And so in some ways, you know, some of these things we documented, I've got to say we didn't, you know, it's not like there's an obvious architectural project at the end. Sometimes there is. But in some ways it was saying that in environments that we aren't familiar with, you have to kind of, you know, you have to change the things you look at. You have to kind of change perhaps the drawing tools that you document. And that you have to kind of, the less you know about the place, the more you have to maybe expand the kind of things that you're looking at, because you'll find surprises that you may have overlooked. So these are 2 communities in the north. These came out of the Venice Biennale. We worked with community members to document their own, we basically asked them to submit photos of their towns. This is Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut. So some are more urban, but they all have this kind of amazing relationship to landscape. So I'm going to show one project that actually preceded or happened in conjunction with some of this work, but that maybe tries to kind of help contextualize you know, what one does with some of this research. So this is a project called the Arctic Food Network, and it began with an observation that there's huge issues of food insecurity in the north. There's a very high rate of people on unemployment. The traditional practices of hunting have diminished, partly from loss of knowledge transfer, partly because with climate change it's more expensive to go out on the land, you need more fuel, you need more this. And so there's greater reliance on food from the south. So this is us kind of documenting what's called a food basket. I don't know if you know what that is, but that's basically like the kind of standard price of the things that any of us need to live. So here it would be your eggs and, what's the cost for a month of your eggs, your milk, your butter, your bread, your cereal, etc. So what you see is like, for instance, in Alaska, I can't read my own drawing. Hold on, I'm going to zoom in. Alaska, something like 13% of your average salary goes to food. In Nunavut, 55%. So you have people, and children in particular, going to school every day with no food. And you have a kind of reliance on southern food. They're eating Twinkies and terrible food, and so you have high rates of obesity and health issues, which they never had before. And so we started to wonder, and of course, food is also part of cultural practices, as in every culture. So getting together, community feasts, et cetera, are so important. And so the question is, could architecture play a role? So we started just by documenting the infrastructures that already exist for supporting food. So they have community freezers, which are these kind of dumb metal boxes that are leaking freon into the landscape. They have some greenhouses, which is a kind of southern importation, so they've been more successful in some towns than others. There's a tradition of kind of cabins where you go out on the land. There's interesting challenges of wayfinding and Wi-Fi. And then there's a kind of amazing tradition of digging freezers underground. So these are some of these cabins. This is actually further south. You wouldn't get this density up in Nunavut. This is northern Quebec. These are these underground freezers that were dug by hand, literally with shovels back in the day, and they would just use the ground as a kind of freezer. With climate change, that's more tricky. The tradition of going out on the land to hunt with the sleds and snowmobiles. And then interesting practices like, because there's such a demand for country food, there's a kind of growing, they actually have markets, which is a very new thing because there's a tradition of sharing food, not selling it. But in some of the bigger communities, there's a kind of monthly market. But as you can see, there's no kind of formal space for this to happen. So and I was telling you about the work of this anthropologist who worked with elders. It was kind of amazing. He gave them GPSs and he said, map or keep these GPSs on you as you go on your traditional trails. And so he got these maps of trails that have been navigated for, now hundreds of years. And so trying to understand where people went to go and hunt was important. And we also wanted to understand, well, what are the food resources? And in fact, it turns out it's very rich. There's seafood, there's all sorts of berries, there's meat, seal, caribou, etc. And we started to make maps of basically the intersection of where there are towns, which are the circles, where are these traditional trails, which are the lines, and then where are these various food sources, which are the different colors of squares. And what we got interested in asking is, could one imagine sort of a system of trade and exchange such that communities could kind of work together to expand their access to traditional foods. So the idea is that, if Pond Inlet had caribou at one season and, Clyde River had seal, could you actually trade and share and expand your access? And so we talked about it as a kind of an Arctic highway of cabins and structures that could be built out incrementally and that would allow this kind of inter-community exchange. And so we made calendars that basically were mapping all these kind of food groups that I was showing you. And the dark is their kind of current season. And then the hatch was us speculating on, through a set of small structures, could we actually expand the access? So in a greenhouse, you could expand the growing season. If you could store it or freeze it or smoke it, you could extend a season and access to it, et cetera. And so we started to imagine a kind of kit of parts that included sheds, hunting cabins, fishing cabins, greenhouses, community spaces, storage spaces. And the idea is that we were perfectly aware that how would we know what a specific community would need? And so the idea is that you could go up to communities and ask them what pieces of this kind of kit might be useful to them and where they would want it. And so it became a kind of more flexible system. And so we imagined these sort of hubs or clusters of structures that could either be in town or out on the land. So this was a view of 3 out on the land. This was one kind of imagining it in town, where you might have bigger structures like a kind of market and community garden and a collective kitchen and a community freezer. And so, as I said, many of these things exist, and it was really partly not about inventing something new, but about saying, could one, rethink their architecture, make them a kind of place and a place of celebration of a kind of culture, rather than being a kind of bad metal freezer or a piece of cardboard in the community. This was one further out on the land, so imagining 2 cabins and a community freezer near where they do mussel farming. This was us kind of playing out the sort of tectonics, which I'm going to talk about. So one of the things we were also interested in was not only, merging traditional and was that me? No. Traditional and contemporary cultural practices, but also building practices. And so we were interested in, on the one hand, using something like snowpack, so kind of leveraging the long tradition of the igloo making as a kind of insulative material, but then, and leveraging traditions like the way they make their sleds is actually through tying the wood, so they don't nail it, they tie it. But then on the other hand, using sort of CNC joints that could be put together as a kind of kit of parts, or leveraging the kind of use of solar panels to kind of for navigation and energy production. And these are technologies that actually are already being innovated in the north, so this wasn't completely far-fetched. So this is the kind of tradition of sled making, and these kind of trying to hybridize traditional and contemporary technologies. And so this was a view of one of these community kitchens where food could be prepared and stored with the kind of wood structural system. And the idea is that some of the wood would just be traditional 2x4s or 2x6s, and then just the kind of joints would be prefabricated. And one of the things that this tied into was how do you get these structures out on the land, right? You have no highways, you have no roads, and so when you're not in town, the only way you can bring them is by sled. And so we looked at, how you could kind of flat pack it, how you could bring it on 2 or 3 snowmobiles, sleds and snowmobiles, how 2 or 3 people could go out and build it over a few days. So the kind of logistics became also part of the sort of logic of it. And then the last thing that was is a kind of ongoing interest is the question of how architecture can be entrepreneurial. So right now there's a kind of reliance on southern imports, which is hugely expensive and gets more and more expensive the further you go north. And we thought, could a system and could architecture participate in a system that actually produced a kind of intra-trade, and if anything might produce a kind of microeconomy of exports, so you could export your Arctic char or your berries, et cetera, and hence shift the kind of economies that kind of drive the system as well. And I think for us, this idea of can architecture be incremental, can it be adaptive, can it kind of respond to a specific culture and climate is something that remains a kind of ongoing interest. So the next project I'm going to show is called Making Camp, Domesticated Wildernesses, and it was produced for the 2015 Biennale. And it began with an observation about camping. Is camping big here? It's okay. I figure this is fairly pervasive. So in Canada, it's like part of the national myth. Like you're either going to the cottage, we discovered, or you're going camping, and this is like part of the national identity along with hockey. And then we realized that the myth and the reality is not quite where the myth is, and so. But one of the things that interested us was. Banham's idea, which he talks about in the architecture of the well-tempered environment, of how humans have sort of controlled and made environment. And he talks about 2 fundamental ways. He talks about, one, the idea of the campfire as a thing that draws you in, that creates comfort and environment by producing an environment that brings you and attracts you. And then he talks about the idea of the tent, which is one of kind of exclusion, right, that you keep out the elements. And this, which is the kind of logic in a way of most camping today. The other thing that's interesting about camping is in some ways ties into the kind of idea of the primitive hut, right? What is the existence minimum? What is the kind of minimum thing we need to kind of be in the environment and kind of and exist and have some level of comfort? And so what got interesting is that we realized we have really innovated the tent. Like there are 1,000 different tents you can get, and there's a lot of money spent on the form and the materials and the water resistance. And there's a lot of innovations on gear. You can get the best backpacks and the best, cooking equipment and the best guitar apparently. What we have not innovated is the campground. And what became interesting is to realize that in fact we have replicated the suburban cul-de-sac that we live in also in our campsites. And so I'd never been camping, which is embarrassing because I'm Canadian. And Mason, who's the American, was like, we've got to go camping. And we didn't quite encounter this, but I have to say, I pictured, the wilderness, and we pull up in a car, and there's screaming kids that aren't even our kids. And I was like, wow, this is not really immersion in nature. This is not what I expected. And so we got interested in understanding how we'd come to be in the sort of, when we think we're going out into nature and communing with it, but we're not. And so how did this come to be? So we unpacked the kind of legislations that created our national parks, the advent of kind of leisure culture, the kind of increased mobility, which made it possible to kind of reach far-flung places. We, as I said, also unpacked all the sort of technical innovations that have enabled camping. And we decided to imagine a new form of camping that would allow a kind of much greater immersive relationship to landscape. So we developed camping brochures. If you've been to national and provincial or national and state parks, you know there's often these nice little brochures that tell you where to go and what amenities. So we made our own. And we, because it was again a biennale, we were interested in making models that would kind of bring people in. And so we basically imagined a set of 5 camping conditions in 5 different landscape conditions. This is a kind of model that, of course, collides these landscapes in ways that would never happen in reality. But that became this kind of test ground for different ways that one might engage landscape. So I'm going to show, and this is a zoom in of a part of the landscape. It was really funny. Everyone kept asking us, what are those poles? And I was like, they're trees. But I can tell you, lay people don't know that. So that was an interesting lesson. So I'm going to show 3 of them really quickly. The first one is called closed loop. And it was this idea of, could one camp on wetlands or even in the middle of lakes, which are, of course, because one of the other things about camping grounds, as you know, is it's a very neutral, you need a flat ground, you need a certain amount of tree clearing. It's always a fairly similar ground condition and landscape condition. The tree species will change, but the things that are prepped to receive cars and et cetera is fairly similar. So we were interested in expanding the grounds on which one could camp. So this was looking at one in a wetland. And part of the interest was, how you could inhabit this landscape without doing damage to it. So there was an idea of building a kind of artificial wetland, which you see here, so that you could, rinse your, so I should also say the other interesting thing about camping is there's all these rituals, right? You make your campfire, you go get the water at the spigot, you wash your dishes at that same spot, you make the fire. So there's all these sort of traditions that we were interested in kind of reintegrating, but reducing the amount of gear that you need to bring, so that a lot of the kind of infrastructure of tents, et cetera, would be built into these sort of collective platforms. So we had a zone for the kind of collective campfires. We had a zone where you could go get your water. We had a kind of artificial wetland where you could go and clean, put out your dirty water and it would get processed before it was sort of returned back to the lake. And then the idea was that the tents were actually built into this sort of communal infrastructure. And so if a tent was not in use, it was vertical, and that if you were going to use one of these tents, you would kind of tether it down and basically occupy it. And one of the observations was this idea that, there's always the form of camping that's like go out on your own into the wilderness. And this was really recognizing an alternative form of communal camping, which is what that photo of all the RVs hinted at, but that could be more immersive. So it's still very much about a kind of collective camping. So this is the sort of various sort of instructions and ways to kind of use this campsite and the different amenities that are offered to it. And this is the kind of model of this kind of giant saucer. And what's interesting is that we subsequently discovered that Parks Canada is actually doing something not quite this bold, but we weren't off the mark, which was interesting. Oh, you know what? I'm going to plug in my computer.
I just realized I'm not plugged in.
Let me see.
Let me just ask you where the plug is.
I am almost done, but I just don't want it to die on me. Oh, perfect. Okay. And so this was a view, of being able to kind of canoe into this kind of platform that was immersed in the landscape. And this is a view of these kind of wetlands, these artificial wetlands that are built into the infrastructure. Another project looked at the question of how can you kind of be in the tree canopy. And so we were interested in taking the kind of vertical layout, the horizontal layout of campsites and basically stacking them vertically and imagining a kind of lookout tower where each platform would be basically a campsite that again the kind of tents were built into the structure, so you could just kind of deploy them almost like a giant umbrella, and that the kind of ground-based platforms were where you would have your campfire, get your water, store your gear, etc. So again, there's sort of some shared and then some more individual amenities. This is this tower in the trees and a view of it. And the idea was that it was as kind of light and delicate as possible, and that there was a kind of series of sort of very thin cables that would, prevent you from falling out, but give you this diaphanous relationship to the landscape. And then a third one, there were 5 in total, but this one was called OffGrid, and we were interested in the idea of the kind of campsite as a kind of infinitely expandable grid of infrastructure. And so we developed a set of different poles, some that were for Wi-Fi, some that could fold and you could attach solar panels, some that could bend and you could attach water collecting surfaces, and then some that you could bend to form tents. And so the idea was that you would get these different hot spots, and so different poles had different functions, but that there was this kind of greater kind of flexibility in the landscape. And these were these kind of Wi-Fi nodes, because we've just installed Wi-Fi in many of our national parks, which seems antithetical to like getting away from it all, but there you go. And so again, for us, this idea of how can architecture engage in the environment and immerse itself is a kind of ongoing interest. So I'm going to end with 2 very quick installations that we've built that maybe continue some of this in slightly different ways. So the first one is called Phase Shift or Impulse. It was built in Montreal in 2015. Inadvertently became a kind of hit that has traveled all over the world, which has been both like a blessing and a curse maybe. But it was a competition, and Montreal, which is actually a vibrant city, but still has quite a few vacant lots. And in the winter in particular, the downtown core tends to empty out. And so they wanted to have an installation that was specifically designed for the winter that would bring people that would, and keep people there. And they asked us to incorporate, part of the brief was to incorporate sound and light. And so we got interested, and we've always been interested in this idea of kind of seriality, how you can take a single, fairly simple thing and through repetition and multiplication and slight variations produce kind of complexity. And we were partly inspired by the famous cover by Joy Division, Unknown Pleasures, and then also interested in the music of Steve Reich, if you know his music, which plays precisely on these ideas of syncopation and being in and out of phase, and really interesting kind of musical patterns. And so we, I don't know exactly how we fell on this idea of sort of giant seesaws that became this kind of super intuitive, like everyone knows what a seesaw is. It's physical. It's really simple. You can make many of them. And then they have kind of formal and informal patterns that are sort of unpredictable. So we basically produced, in the end, 2 sizes of seesaws that were really these sort of hugely enlarged seesaws. And that the seesaws had a sensor so that when they were activated, they would emit sound and they would emit light. And we worked with a really interesting sound artist who teaches at U of T. So he created a kind of set of tones that would create these kind of informal, unpredictable soundscapes. And so this was it installed on the first day before there was snow. So there were 30 of them. This is it kind of in action. This is it after snow. And this is it in the depths of snow. And I'm going to see, how am I doing for time? I think I'm okay. I've got 2 more minutes. Let me just quickly, I'm not sophisticated enough to embed, or to try and embed. Let me see if, oh, interesting. It does not like, never mind, it does not like my website. Okay, I'm going to just keep going. So this idea that, again, of how could one be immersed in the environment through something that was really kind of interactive and engaging was something that interested us. And then a second installation, which we completed a year or 2 later, which was called Screenplay, was again interested in kind of the user activating and being able to kind of transform the kind of piece. And so it began with this idea of 9 screens that were made up of colored and mirrored fins, and that when people would step into one of these, light would be activated. So there was this kind of fairly intuitive sort of trigger sensor. You step on it and light is emitted. And we were interested in, the kind of kaleidoscopic possibilities of the mirrored and the kind of multiple screens and the layering of screens. And so this is it installed this fall, actually, in Toronto. And so you can see it kind of changes lighting qualities and degrees depending on how many users are in it, and produces this kind of ethereal sort of quality and a kind of inside out, because you can be both in or out of the, and you occasionally get an electric cowboy that comes and visits your piece. So I'm going to end it there because you can't top an electric cowboy. But I think for us this question of sort of trying to find the sort of places where architecture can insert itself and find new territories of kind of engagement, whether it's through new typologies, new relationships to landscape, new kind of ways of interacting with the environment is what kind of continues to fascinate us both in our own work and in our teaching. So, thank you.
Is it working? Thank you so much for the lecture. It's really informative. I wanted to ask, in terms of your research with regards to the North and Arctic, as climate change continues, will you go back to revisit the research or to continue documenting change?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, actually, I wouldn't say we put pause, but actually we've been trying to work on projects that are more real and perhaps may get built. We'll see. We'll keep our fingers crossed. But we're actually just now kind of going back to the research phase and want to kind of engage questions of housing, which is a huge issue. The housing conditions are like virtually third world, and part of it is climate change means they're all kind of falling apart. The grounds are kind of settling, so there's huge issues. And And the kind of ways of life are changing. There's a famous Inuit activist who said we went from igloos to internet in 40 years. And it's true. There's very few societies that have kind of undergone such radical transformation. You know, they're all on Facebook. They're super kind of technologically savvy. But then they're, living in like housing conditions that are, pretty shocking for Canada or any, country. So there's a lot, we're excited to kind of continue the work.
Does their e-waste follow our same cycles, like in the South?
Well, it's interesting. In the North, there's a rule, what goes up stays up. So nothing leaves because it's so, which I think that may be changing slightly, but for the most part, the boats deliver goods, but there isn't a system of like repatriating waste, not even e-waste, but like, building waste. And so there are these dumps, and actually what's crazy is that they sometimes catch fire. So Iqaluit, which was the capital, it is the capital of Nunavut, so it has about 7,000 people. The dump burned for like weeks, I think, if not a month. And there was like advisories to like pregnant women to not go out. Like it, so there's a whole kind of, I would say partly a failure of infrastructure, but also we haven't really, we're using our systems, like we impose our methods of building housing. We, think of a dump because here we can control it. We have the infrastructure to kind of maintain it. And it doesn't quite work that way up there. What is interesting is that they do a lot of informal recycling. So actually people call the dumps in many towns Canadian Tire, which is sort of like our Home Depot in Canada. And they'll say, I'm going to the Canadian Tire, because, people will like throw out old shingles or like an old door, and then someone else will go and be like, oh, I can use that door. So there is actually, much less waste than we have, as you can imagine, just partly because also things are so expensive. And so even like the sea cans get reused. So it's, but the challenges are still there. It's maybe less e-waste, but general waste is a huge issue that they haven't really figured out.
If you need some time and air filled, you can count on me. Hey, thank you so much. That was really great.
Thanks.
I was just wondering about, at one point in the lecture, you said something to the tune of, well, on the Many Norths work. Not all of this is immediate, suggests an immediate architectural output.
Right.
And I was just wondering to myself, what other kinds of value structures that you all think are important,
right.
and how do you find those? How do you produce them for yourselves? So I think a lot of the territorial research and the mapping research, or even just the photography, like the field work itself, is itself astonishing.
And in fairness, the photographs are rarely ours. We found people, just full credit, like a few are ours, but a lot of them are like, like the mussel farming. We did not go mussel farming.
Yeah.
We found an amazing photographer who had done it. But yes,
Right.
Sorry.
But do those become relevant, valuable, et cetera, in other kinds of conversations?
I think so. I mean, we really saw, it's funny, I've been thinking a lot about like method because I've been writing grants, and when you try and, as an architect, when you try and present a grant to social scientists, they're like, we look like fluff balls, I will just say. It's really challenging. And I try and I look at Many Norths and I ask myself, is it research? Like I don't think a social scientist would call it research. And sometimes I sort of think like, what is this thing we've made? But I do think that spatializing and visualizing things has huge value. And I think part of our argument with something like Many Norths is that until you visualize it in some ways, you can't even begin to factor it into design. So like, for instance, many of these communities, snowmobile is the primary way of moving. And so there are roads, but then snowmobilers just go everywhere. And private property is a very, no one has fences. So people just like snowmobile through your backyard. And so I can say that verbally. but if I were a planner, until someone maps that, it's really hard to know what to do with. And similarly, you know, the food resources, like, you know, until you can visualize where they are and the fact that that food resource is in proximity to this town, you can't even begin to ask yourself, you know, can I intervene? So I think the act of documenting is partly to expand the kind of tools that architects use. Particularly in the north, it's like very, I mean, I didn't actually explicitly say this, but it's, you know, entirely driven by economics and efficiency. It's like there's such a shortage of everything. The question is, how cheaply can I build it? And I needed it yesterday. So there is no architect, there's no planner that's going to spend time doing these kinds of things. And so partly it's just a way of saying that in this environment, surely we've got to do more than take the kind of site plan with the water line, and like that can't be our first tool for design, that there's got to be these other things that we factor in, and if we can't draw them, I don't know how to factor them in. So I think there is value, and I think it's you know, some of those things we documented ultimately factored into projects either before or after, and you know, some certainly won't. Sorry, they won't become our projects, but I think they posit a kind of expanded approach to site thinking. I don't want to say site analysis, but maybe site thinking that I also think transcends, you know, the north. Like I think you could do this. I think you could do this in, you know, the Canadian and North American suburb, and this is in a way where flat space began. Is that like if you even, you know, when you start to unpack like a conventional suburb, it is so weird and surreal in some ways. And if you started to document fully, you know, the life that happens in a Walmart parking lot and, you know, the kind of infrastructures that support, you know, our residential, you'd find equally kind of amazing things. It's just we don't draw it, and so we can't find it, I would say.
Hi. So I did a short externship at a firm, and I heard I heard something like, or I asked a question of, do you guys make a lot of cool visual stuff? And the firm basically told me, oh, that's a very academic question. Like, we don't have time to create those visual stuff. And a lot of the projects that you presented today aren't necessarily what I think of professional firms do to make money necessarily, right? So like.
Right.
In your work or in the office, how do you balance between those work? Or is there a balance? Is there a what's your modus operandi?
Right. No, that's a good question. So obviously something like Many Norths is like the opposite. I mean, it's like a giant money-losing venture. That was just like a labor of love, and it's funded by research grants and things that allowed us to sustain, you know, many people working on it full time for like 2 years virtually, in addition to like our time. Some of the projects, I mean, one of the things that we got interested in a while back, and Arctic Food Network is an example of this, we started off doing competitions as all firms do, and actually I was saying my first time in Tennessee was we won second place in a competition for Memphis, and you know, if we had won that, I would not be presenting this work, I'd be presenting something else. And competitions are great, but at some point you get tired of not winning them. And as my partner said, you know, if we just invent our own projects, we're guaranteed to win because we're the only ones doing them. And we sort of, you know, I say that partly in jest, but we got interested in this idea of self-generating projects. And this, is, I think, is partly tied to the idea of detective work, is that, you know, part of what I think architects are really good at doing is synthetic knowledge. So, you know, if you take the fox and the hedgehog, you know, some disciplines are really good at being super knowledgeable and digging deep into one thing or a kind of narrower field. And I think architects and landscape architects are, you know, we're not specialists, but we are really good at, you know, bridging between technology, culture, you know, social sciences, and what I think we haven't been trained to do, but, or in a way it's what thesis is, so we get trained momentarily, but we often don't get a chance to leverage it beyond that, is to kind of find untapped opportunities. And so a lot of these projects, either we had seed funding or we figured out how to something like Arctic Food Network, we had won the Prix de Rome and we took the money and used part of it to say, well, we're going to spend some time developing this. It was actually part of a set of 7 projects. That was the only one that got pushed to that level. And then there are other projects. We don't do too much client-based work, but some of it is. And then the economics are slightly different. But I do think that like drawing and or making models or whatever it is a kind of crucial tool. Even in a kind of more conventional firm. And I think we live in an environment that doesn't privilege design, and so no one wants to pay for design, so it gets trickled down to a sort of, our profession gets squeezed, and it makes it harder and harder to do this kind of work. But I do think it's important to kind of carve out moments. And I was recently in Seattle actually, and it was introduced to kind of firm's work, and they've done pretty amazing like micro research on it related to healthcare, and and so even though it was there was a client in a project, they had found a kind of moment to do some really interesting research that directly informed the work, and I think it's crucial. It's easy to preach that from a kind of position where we're first academics and our office is a kind of parallel venture. But I would urge you all as you go into offices to not lose the kind of desire to ask questions and invent that you have, that gets privileged in schools. Because I think it'll be the death of our profession if we cede that power. And I think partly we're interested in some ways in like trying to reclaim the agency of architecture, like and hence this idea of like searching out opportunities. And what's interesting, we haven't been entirely successful, but like the Making Camp, we got interviewed by the a kind of national radio, and then 2 days later, Parks Canada was like, oh, we heard about this, we'd like to speak to you. In the end, it didn't go anywhere, but it was interesting to find out, like, and we gave them a tour of the exhibition, and I thought, they're going to think we're nuts, because they just heard it on the radio. And they were like, oh, no, this is totally in line. It's just, the logistics of national government, you can just imagine, is very painful. But it was interesting that there were synergies, and the same thing with the Arctic Food Network. For a long time, there were various groups that were interested in, like, prototyping it. So this was something we cooked out of our head, and it did resonate. So I think that's absolutely a kind of possible mode. And there are a lot of practices doing that. I mean, we're by no means alone in that.
Is this on? Okay. At various points kind of during the Q&A, you've alluded to a method of investigation that is emerging out of your work that goes beyond the particular project. And it seems to me that this often involves collaborations with other disciplines. Would you perhaps give us 2 or 3 kind of tenets or rules of thumb that are part of this method?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know if we have rules of thumb, but
That's why I said tenets.
yeah. I mean, it's funny. One version of sometimes when we present our work, we've started to talk about this idea of being. I'm going to get to your answer, but this idea of being undisciplined, because we talk about transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity, and we started to like this idea that we were sort of undisciplined in the sense of, a little bit looking outside the discipline of architecture, but to ask the questions, but then to find the answers within architecture. And this comes back to your question, and I wanted to add that afterwards, is that, for us, in the end, a kind of key question when we make drawings is still like, how is it spatial? Because if it, some things are political or it's a kind of question of legislation or it's a question of economics, and those things are kind of, we recognize, outside of our control. So part of it is like, is there a place where the design disciplines in the broadest sense can have leverage? Something like the Arctic Food Network, I wouldn't even say we partnered, but we found this work by this anthropologist, and there was no way, and that's true for the whole Many Norths book. I mean, this would be like 50 people's dissertation. I mean, like each case study, there's no way we could do that work. And so we're very honest that what we're doing, I mean, sometimes we're documenting something new, but for the most part, we're spatializing things that are either described in word or oral history, yeah. But in the case of something like the anthropologist, he had these sort of not such legible maps, and we were interested in using that as a base, but then also to expand, like, what are the other, how do they navigate? How do they read the landscape? What do they bring with them? So that's a kind of, maybe one example. In the cases of the installations, we worked with sound artists and lighting designers, again, knowing that, like, we all have our, disciplinary boundaries. So both in a kind of more tangible project and in a more speculative project, we try and figure out what it is that we do well and where we need someone else to kind of complement and enrich the question and the results. If that answers it.
Okay. So please come down and look at the photos.
Yes.
So thanks again.
Thank you. Oh, I'm glad. Thank you.